Welcome to lecture 3.2. I'm going to do this. I think this will maybe take 5 minutes or less. Is give a little bit of setup to the Levitt Porter paper. First thing I want you to read, I included in Dropbox 4 pages from my book, Left Turn on Media Bias. But the thing I wanted you to read was I was trying to explain what an endogeneity problem is in that book, and I think I did a pretty good job. I think that if you're a layman's going to understand what an endogeneity problem is, it's in a non-technical way. This is one of the I think one of the best places to look. I'm biased, of course, um, but the key thing I wanted you to see was this advice from Jim Poterba. And this was Steve Levitt's advisor when Steve was a grad student at MIT. And Jim Poterba, it actually came from when Coleman Strumpf, who's now a professor at Wake Forest, told me, yeah, that's what Poterba always tells us, that if you want to find a good instrument, so an instrument's what solves an endogeneity problem, it gives you a natural experiment. So if you want a good instrument, what you have to do is think of the instrument first and then think of the problem that it would solve, not the other way around. And there's so many papers, especially when I taught political science. I would see so many political science students would just say, "Oh, I'll think of an instrument." Well, see, now you just that very sentence that you told me says it's not going to be a proper instrument. Because a proper instrument, if Jim Poterba is right, you got to the instrument has got to come to you, and then you think, what does this solve? And it's things like the Vietnam War. That turns out there was this lottery that determined who was drafted and not, and some economists said, oh wow, here's a natural experiment. What would this help solve? And like people with the bad lottery numbers, or yeah, the bad, or the ones who are probably going to get drafted, they may have tried to get a deferment by getting education. This is an exogenous shock that causes people to get an education. There's a case. And then the one I talked about was when Steve Levitt was, he started off, he was just doing stuff on political economy, and he had been putting in data on congressional and mayoral elections, and he noticed that House elections are every 2 years, and presidential elections are every 4 years, and you think, um, this is not a good instrument for anything. If you think that this fourth year, whatever the presidential election year is, someone could say, well, it's also an Olympic year. That's what's causing it. And what you need is things that are staggered. And he noticed that different cities often had different term lengths for the mayor. And then they also varied, even if they had, all the cities that had a 2-year term for the mayor, some of them would elect their mayors in odd years, some of them in even years. And Steve said, wait, this has got to be a good instrument for something. And that's when I thought, well, maybe it's police. And so everyone knows him as the guy who does the economics of crime. But that wasn't his plan. His plan was to be in political economy, and he was doing this data on elections. And he knew from what Poterba had told us, think of, you see an instrument, think of the problem that it would help solve. And that's why he went into economics of crime. So I want you to see that. And I think that advice from Jim Poterba, I mean, that 3 minutes of advice may be the most useful advice to any economics PhD student can get. There, you heard it. The 3 minutes of the most useful advice you can hear, the most useful lesson of your entire career as a student. The next thing I wanted you to see was, so I met Steve when he was a grad student. I had a position as a postdoc at MIT, and later as the next year as a joint one, Harvard and MIT. So I was hung out around there for 2 years. got to know Steve when he was a grad student. Quickly saw, to my credit, saw this guy is genius. And I said, this guy's going to win a Nobel Prize. And I talked to Steve about this. I predicted that before even his parents predicted that. And I think I'm going to be right. Steve will. And I predicted it first. I've known him. We've written 2 papers together, and so when I decided to do this Levitt Porter paper, I wrote Steve an email, and I've posted that email on Dropbox along with my quick response to him. And I just asked him, how'd you get that idea? And I thought he was going to tell me that it was something like that Poterba advice, that he thought of, if if you have one car going eastbound, one car going westbound, and the car going eastbound is drunk, and that hits cars on the westbound side, that is going to select. That's almost a random selection of cars from the westbound side. And that's got to be an instrument for something. That's what I thought he was going to tell me, and that's not what he said. Instead, he said that although I thought it was going to be Poterba's advice about how to find an instrument, it was not. But still, it did involve Poterba, and this guy, Jim Poterba, may be one of the greatest PhD teachers ever in economics. But so Steve was in the office of Jim Poterba, and Steve was thinking about something about the externality of alcohol. And he was saying, really, if you just drink a little bit, there's not really an externality. Most people are responsible, and a lot of people don't drive at all, or even if they do, they're not hampered that much. And so, but if you drink a lot, that's a big externality. And so, what would be the optimal taxation because on alcohol? Because the problem is with lots of the drinking, there's no externality at all. And apparently, he did a theory paper, and Poterba said, no one's going to be interested in this. And that's so interesting that Poterba could see that you're not going to get it published in any great journal. And then Poterba said, but if you could do something to measure how dangerous or what the effect is of alcohol, that would be great. And Steve said he left the office and he had to walk across the MIT campus to go to this mini seminar. And that's where he thought of the idea. He thought, there's got to be something about 2 car crashes versus 1 car crash, 2 drunk drivers crashing versus 1 drunk driver crashing. That's got to reveal something. He said that he thought of that along that walk. And then he said, Steve said that he couldn't think of a way how to estimate it. And then he was told Jack Porter one day the idea. And so Jack Porter wrote down the model in like 5 minutes. Now, for good or bad, I think what this class does is it teaches you how to be like Jack Porter, how to, write the likelihood function and estimate these things of these very interesting questions that Steve Levitt may have asked. Now, Jack Porter, he is like this distinguished professor. He has an endowed chair at University of Wisconsin. He's done great. This guy's had a great career, but I don't think he's not as famous as Steve Levitt, and he hasn't had a book that sold millions and millions of copies and made. I think Steve has made at least $10 million from that. There's even a movie or documentary made out of Freakonomics. So Porter's had a lot of success, but probably not as much as what Steve has. And unfortunately, I'm teaching you how to be like Jack Porter. And so how do you what's the lesson? How to get these great ideas and think of these great, interesting questions like Steve did. That's the way you really become famous. And it's best I can tell. The only thing I can glean from this little anecdote, and I wrote Steve back, I said, I think the thing to think of is that don't text when you're on campus. So if instead Steve had gotten out, it turned out cell phones didn't exist at that time. If he instead had gotten a cell phone and just went across campus texting and not daydreaming about this problem, he would have never written this paper. And so that's my advice to students: text less, daydream more. I think that's the lesson. Okay, so that's the intro, a little background to this, and I'll see you in 3.3. We'll start giving some of the details of that paper. Okay, see you there.